There's no mistaking it. Canada has had enough. After months of erratic trade policy from Donald Trump's second term, including the infamous 35% tariff threat on all Canadian goods and the 50% slap on Brazilian coffee. Just to cozy up to Bolsonaro, Ottawa has finally drawn a line in the snow. And unlike Trump's bluster, Canada's retaliation isn't theatrical. It's surgical, precise, and most importantly, enduring. What Trump and his MAGA-aligned trade hawks failed to understand is that Canada was never going to engage in a chest-thumping contest. Canada doesn't do tantrums. It does plans, blueprints, long games. And in this game, Canada has now launched a full-scale economic diversification operation with one goal in mind: economic independence from an unpredictable United States. The tipping point wasn't just the tariffs. It was the way they were implemented. With zero warning, Trump announced sweeping tariffs during a rally in Cleveland, surrounded by steel executives and war veteran lapel pins, ranting about Canadian economic betrayal and fentanyl, as if Justin Trudeau himself were moonlighting as a drug mule. The fact that Canada has nothing to do with the fentanyl crisis didn't matter. It was never about facts. It was about domination, optics, and distraction. But Canada wasn't distracted.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
Within 48 hours, the Prime Minister's office convened an emergency economic roundtable. Not a press conference, not a Twitter tirade. A closed-door, data-driven summit with provincial premiers, industry leaders, and economic strategists. The mission? Mobilize every tool in Canada's economic arsenal to insulate the country from U.S. shocks. Step 1. Expansion of the Indo-Pacific Trade Corridor. While Trump yanked the U.S. out of multilateral trade frameworks like the TPP, Canada doubled down. Trade envoys were sent to Vietnam, Malaysia, India, and South Korea with one goal: increase market share. Canada's agri-food, critical minerals, aerospace, and clean tech sectors began shifting export contracts away from U.S. firms and toward emerging economies hungry for stable partnerships. Step 2. A bold internal trade unification push. For decades, Canada's own provinces had interprovincial barriers to trade, red tape, regulatory gaps, transport bottlenecks. Not anymore. Under emergency coordination agreements, interprovincial trade rules were slashed. Ontario and Quebec signed a rare manufacturing harmonization agreement, while Alberta fast-tracked pipeline approvals to redirect energy exports westward to the Pacific. The long-talked-about Canadian economic firewall was finally being built, not against a foreign adversary, but against an unreliable neighbor. Step 3. Retaliatory precision tariffs. No, not the kind that slam back with bluster. Canada imposed narrow, highly targeted tariffs aimed at U.S. states that depend on Canadian exports: Wisconsin cheese, Kentucky bourbon, Florida citrus. But here's the genius. Canada didn't just target products. It targeted politically sensitive congressional districts. The same kind of battleground zones Trump needs to hold to survive 2026 midterms. The retaliation wasn't loud. It was quiet and deadly. Then came the psychological shift, the cultural response. For generations, Canadians crossed the border for outlet malls, big box stores, and cheap gas. Not anymore. Local campaigns exploded under slogans like "Buy Canadian" or "Go Broke," "Your neighbor needs your dollar," and "Skip the states, support our stores." Canadian consumers didn't just adjust, they rebelled. Domestic tourism inched up, U.S. travel dropped double digits, and Canadian e-commerce boomed as shoppers abandoned American platforms like Amazon in favor of local startups backed by federal grants and digital subsidies. Even Canadian farmers, long tethered to the U.S. for everything from soybeans to feed corn, began forming cooperatives to export jointly through Pacific ports. New trade hubs sprang up in Vancouver, Halifax, and Thunder Bay, reborn not as colonial outposts, but as sovereign trade nexuses free from Washington's mood swings. Meanwhile, U.S. manufacturers, especially in border states, began sounding the alarm. Michigan automakers suddenly couldn't get magnesium castings on time. Vermont's dairy industry faced surplus pricing chaos as Canadian importers walked away. Iowa soybean processors discovered that their northbound exports had vanished overnight. But the real dagger came from Wall Street. As U.S. markets began pricing the chaos from the Trump tariffs, Canadian equities, especially in diversified infrastructure, clean energy, and critical minerals, started outperforming. Foreign direct investment began pivoting north, with European and Asian conglomerates shifting operations to Canada, drawn by its stable regulatory environment and new trade access to Asian markets. In this new world, stability was a new currency, and Canada, once mocked as America's little brother, suddenly looked like the only adult left in the room. Trump's response? More noise, more rallies, more finger-pointing. But the damage was done. His 35% tariff bluff had backfired catastrophically. Instead of bending Canada to his will, he had accelerated its emancipation, and the consequences for American power? Dire. By weaponizing trade without strategy, Trump didn't just lose a partner. He sent a warning signal to every other ally. The U.S. is no longer a safe bet. Germany accelerated talks with China. Japan reaffirmed its Indo-Pacific security trade pacts. Even the UK, once desperate for a bilateral U.S. deal post-Brexit, began floating the idea of a Northern Hemisphere bloc, an economic coalition anchored by Canada and the EU, excluding the U.S. It's not that Canada wanted this outcome. It's that Trump made it necessary. His misunderstanding of Canada, their diplomacy, their unity, their resolve, was his fatal mistake. He treated them as weak, passive, dependent. What he didn't see was a country that remembers humiliation, studies failure, and prepares in silence. While Trump played the cameras, Canada built the chessboard. And when the tariffs came crashing down like thunder, they didn't just weather the storm. They rewired the grid. Today, the effects are being felt in every U.S. factory line halted for missing parts, in every small-town retail chain short on imported goods, and in every congressional office now flooded with complaints from angry business owners and union leaders. So, yes, Canada took urgent action, not by screaming, but by recalibrating their entire economic architecture, not with revenge, but with vision. They didn't play Trump's game. They built a new one, and now it's Trump who's begging for talks. Behind closed doors, his advisors are quietly asking Ottawa for face-saving off-ramps, minor concessions, a photo op to spin as a win. But the tables have turned. The leverage is gone. Canada hold the cards, and they've learned to play them with patience, power, and poise. The message from Canada to Trump is clear. We warned you. We waited. You broke it. We rebuilt it without you. And the rest of the world? They're watching. They're taking notes. Because what Canada just did wasn't just retaliation, it was revolution. The transformation that followed Canada's retaliation has been nothing short of historic. What began as a defensive economic maneuver has evolved into a full-fledged reorientation of Canadian economic identity. In the span of just a few months, what was once seen as a vulnerable satellite economy orbiting the United States has grown into a resilient, interconnected, and globally respected power, precisely because it refused to stoop to chaos. Instead of engaging in rhetorical warfare, Canada let the numbers speak. New bilateral trade agreements with Vietnam, Indonesia, Chile, and the UAE solidified. Canada's exports to non-U.S. markets hit record highs. Copper, maple products, aircraft parts, and hydrogen technologies all found new buyers abroad. And these weren't just one-off trade shipments. They were long-term partnerships, forged in a vacuum created by America's abandonment of multilateralism. This wasn't luck. It was deliberate. Canada had prepared for this moment. For years, Canadian think tanks, trade councils, and provincial leaders had warned of over-reliance on the U.S. market. Trump's tariff storm was simply the trigger that galvanized these long-simmering ideas into action. Federal funding flooded into export accelerator programs, SME digital infrastructure upgrades, and port expansions in Vancouver and Prince Rupert. Canadian universities collaborated with export consortia to train a new generation of globally oriented entrepreneurs. Even more significantly, Canada's pivot created a domino effect across other mid-sized economies. In Brussels, trade officials began speaking of the Canadian model, a strategy of calm decoupling from toxic partnerships, executed with civility and confidence. In New Delhi, Canada was praised for its simultaneous advancement of climate policy and trade liberalization, offering a stark counterpoint to the U.S.'s contradictory approach of fossil-first rhetoric paired with erratic tariffs. Meanwhile, American business leaders, many of whom had initially supported Trump's protectionist rhetoric, began sounding the alarm. The National Association of Manufacturers released a report noting that U.S. firms dependent on Canadian aluminum and critical minerals were now facing pricing and sourcing uncertainty, leading to cost spikes and production delays. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce followed with its own warning. The country was isolating itself from a rapidly integrating global trade environment. Trump, undeterred, doubled down. He began teasing Phase 2 tariffs, targeting Canadian pharmaceuticals and tech services. But this only further confirmed what Canada already knew. It could no longer afford to rely on Washington's mood swings. The pivot wasn't personal. It was survival. Canada's political culture also began to reflect this realignment. Debates in Parliament shifted from how to patch up relations with the U.S. to how to deepen ties with the Indo-Pacific, Latin America, and the EU. Conservative and liberal MPs alike began referencing the post-American economy, signaling a growing consensus that economic sovereignty required diversification at all costs. Culturally, this shift manifested in ways that were impossible to ignore. In Canadian film and television, new themes emerged: celebrations of independence, of Canada as a builder, a diplomat, a bridge between worlds. Public art campaigns emphasized Made in Canada, pride not with jingoism, but with dignity and purpose. National holidays became more than symbolic. They were platforms to showcase economic success stories born from the tariff retaliation era. On the U.S. side, however, the disarray was deepening. The agricultural sector, already battered by climate events, saw Canadian buyers vanish overnight. Midwestern farmers, who had for decades relied on stable northern exports, were left stranded. In Montana, wheat producers began lobbying for tariff rollbacks, while in Maine, fisheries associations pleaded for resumption of normal lobster trade. But Washington, consumed by infighting and Trump's own political calculations, failed to respond. Trade advisors cycled through staff like a revolving door. White House briefings became more theatrical and less informative. At one particularly disastrous press conference, Trump mistakenly blamed Canada for sabotaging California's avocado supply, a claim that was swiftly debunked, but which still managed to trend online for days. The diplomatic community wasn't laughing. In fact, behind closed doors at international summits, U.S. diplomats were finding themselves increasingly isolated. Allies questioned not just America's policies, but its competence. Canadian officials, by contrast, were welcomed as voices of moderation and strategy. The world was adjusting, and fast. The most poignant moment came during the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation (APEC) Summit. While Trump skipped the event entirely, Carney delivered a keynote address titled Trade Without Intimidation. It was a masterclass in modern diplomacy, data-driven, humble, and firm. Carney didn't mention Trump by name, but the message was unmistakable. Canada was done waiting for its largest trading partner to grow up. The future lay in cooperation, not coercion. Back at home, Canadian industries weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Clean tech firms, once dependent on American venture capital, now secured funding from Singapore, Berlin, and Abu Dhabi. Aerospace suppliers in Manitoba launched joint ventures with Brazilian and South Korean firms. Even Canada's once modest cybersecurity sector began scaling up, fueled by partnerships with Scandinavian networks seeking alternatives to American surveillance-linked software. And then there were the jobs. Contrary to the dire warnings issued by Trump-aligned economists, Canada's unemployment rate remained stable. In some sectors, green energy, logistics, specialty manufacturing, it even dropped. This was not a fluke. It was a result of a deliberate policy to funnel tariff-related revenue into retraining programs, wage subsidies, and innovation hubs. Unlike the U.S., where tariff revenues were often redirected toward deficit spending or defense budgets, Canada invested in its people. That contrast between investment and bluster, between strategy and spectacle, became the defining feature of this new trade era. For Canadians, the realization was liberating. They didn't need America to validate their economy. They didn't need the U.S. market to survive. Canada had outgrown its role as a compliant neighbor. It had matured into a global player, respectful, self-sufficient, and unafraid. And for the United States, the lesson, if they choose to learn it, is sobering. Gone are the days when threats and tariffs could bend allies to America's will. In a world shaped by complexity, interdependence, and rapid transformation, stability is more valuable than size. Consistency trumps charisma, and respect is not earned by shouting. It is earned by showing up, staying steady, and leading with principle. Trump's legacy, as it pertains to trade, may not be written in steel, aluminum, or coffee. It may instead be remembered as the moment when America's closest allies stopped asking how to please Washington and started asking how to move on. Canada was the first to walk away. It may not be the last. As the dust settled on the initial shock waves of Trump's tariff campaigns, the global community took note, not of the noise, but of the silence. Canada hadn't marched into press conferences with megaphones or levied retaliatory threats with fanfare. Instead, they quietly pivoted, diversified, adapted, and in that stillness, they reshaped their economic destiny. From Ottawa to Edmonton, a quiet confidence took root. What started as a necessary defense mechanism against U.S. economic aggression evolved into a blueprint for long-term prosperity. By refusing to engage in a shouting match, Canada had tapped into something far more potent: credibility. And credibility, in a fractured global trade environment, was currency. Investors who had once defaulted to Wall Street now looked north. Venture capitalists in Tokyo, Zurich, and Dubai took renewed interest in Canada's clean tech sectors, agri-tech incubators, and digital commerce ecosystems. The trend was unmistakable. While Trump's America had become synonymous with volatility and unpredictability, Canada projected stability and direction. This shift was especially visible in the logistics and supply chain sectors. Canadian ports, once considered secondary to U.S. giants like Los Angeles and New York, saw a surge in activity. Shipping firms began rerouting traffic to Vancouver and Halifax, citing reliability, climate adaptation measures, and labor harmony. Even the Panama Canal Authority noted increased Canadian freight as exporters from Southeast Asia preferred dealing with Canada's clear customs protocols and trade clarity over the erratic swings of U.S. tariffs and renegotiated deals. But this wasn't just a win for Canada. It was a reckoning for the United States. American manufacturers, especially those with cross-border supply chains, were feeling the pinch. The very industries Trump claimed to protect, automotive, steel, electronics, were seeing shrinking margins, layoff notices, and investor pullouts. Plants that once thrived on parts that shuttled across the border daily were now facing delays, inventory shortages, and cost spikes due to inconsistent tariff rules and bureaucratic confusion. The irony was unmistakable. The America First doctrine had made American supply chains last in efficiency. And then came the public opinion shift. Polls conducted in swing states began to reflect growing unease with Trump's trade policies. In Michigan, union leaders, initially supportive of tariff protections, began voicing frustration. They weren't seeing jobs return. They were seeing suppliers vanish, international buyers dry up, and plants idling. Farmers in Iowa, once hopeful that tariffs would punish foreign competition, now faced bankruptcy. Soybean exports to China had plummeted. Corn prices stagnated, and Canadian grain, previously a quiet presence in Asian markets, was now capturing share with consistent pricing and favorable trade terms. In response, Canada doubled down, not in retaliation, but in investment. The Canadian Infrastructure Bank announced record funding for intermodal transport systems, linking rail, truck, and port in seamless efficiency. The provinces collaborated on digital infrastructure, ensuring that even rural Canadian businesses had access to international e-commerce platforms. Trade schools were retooled to produce logistics experts, sustainability engineers, and export specialists. And in foreign capitals, Canada's reputation soared. At the World Economic Forum, Canada's model was showcased not as a hedge against U.S. chaos, but as a forward-thinking alternative. Delegations from nations wary of Washington's erratic policies increasingly requested consultations with Canadian trade envoys. They wanted to learn how to negotiate agreements without posturing, how to build multi-sector partnerships without drama. In Africa, where infrastructure and energy partnerships were booming, Canadian firms were outpacing American companies, not because they had more capital, but because they brought long-term guarantees, respect for sovereignty, and no risk of overnight sanctions or sudden tariff hikes. This global realignment wasn't lost on Washington's inner circles. Behind closed doors, think tanks and trade officials began sounding alarms. A leaked memo from a U.S. trade advisory panel described Canada's rise as an asymmetrical threat to American economic influence, not because of force, but because of finesse. The memo noted, "The Canadian trade strategy is not designed to beat us, it's designed to get us." For Trump, this was intolerable. In a series of late-night social media tirades, he accused Canada of betrayal, of undercutting U.S. markets, of being ungrateful neighbors. But the world had stopped reacting. Diplomats knew the difference between tantrums and truth. Meanwhile, Canada stayed the course. The federal government, working closely with provincial leaders, launched a 3-year National Economic Resilience Agenda. It focused on 3 pillars: trade diversification, domestic production revitalization, and technological sovereignty. Trade diversification saw Canada solidify deals with ASEAN nations, deepen its footprint in Latin America, and expand cooperation with the European Free Trade Association. Domestically, funds were allocated to bolster critical manufacturing, batteries, medical equipment, semiconductors, sectors that had previously relied heavily on U.S. imports. Technological sovereignty, perhaps the boldest move, focused on decoupling Canadian digital infrastructure from U.S. control platforms. National data centers, Canadian-designed cybersecurity protocols, and investments in domestic AI research marked a declaration of independence in the digital age. And still, the average Canadian felt the impact, not as crisis, but as opportunity. Small manufacturers in Quebec found new markets in Germany and South Korea. Family farms in Saskatchewan joined agricultural cooperatives that exported directly to Vietnam and the UAE. Artisans in British Columbia began selling crafts in Australia via Canadian platforms, no longer at the mercy of volatile U.S. e-commerce sites. This bottom-up renaissance was the final nail in the coffin for Trump's trade strategy, because while his tariffs were designed to corner Canada into submission, they had instead sparked a grassroots economic transformation. And this didn't go unnoticed by America's own states. Governors in border states, Minnesota, New York, Michigan, began quietly reaching out to Canadian officials, seeking bilateral agreements independent of Washington's dysfunction. Discussions of cross-border climate projects, shared infrastructure, and regional trade corridors began to take shape, all beneath the radar of federal politics. Canada didn't retaliate with noise. It responded with strategy. While Trump shouted, Canada built. In the silence, they found power. In the chaos, they chose clarity. Their quiet pivot reshaped alliances, trade, and trust. The message to the world was unmistakable. Leadership isn't loud. It's smart, steady, and built to last.